Hi, this is Paul, and what we're doing today is something a little different. My friends here, Mark and Zach, have their own podcast, and so we're going to kind of try to hit two birds with one stone. We have something for my channel and something for their channel, and Mark can edit video and audio, and so he can have a different introduction if he wants to, however it goes. But we talked about doing this. And I thought, well, let's have Mark and Zach introduce themselves. This is sort of nice for my channel because it'll give you a little bit of window into the Christian Reformed Church in Northern California, and this other side of me that you all don't see so much because you're looking at me through a YouTube lens. So who wants to go first?
I guess I could start. I am Zach Dewey. I'm the associate pastor here at Almond Valley, or Almond Valley, as anybody outside of our town would say. And yeah, as Paul said, it's a Christian Reformed church. I've been here since 2017. I am sort of the outsider in this conversation. If you listen to our podcast, you know that I'm not from the CRC. This is my first post in the CRC. I'm sort of an ecclesiological mutt, I guess you could say. And it was in my college years that I sort of read my way into Reformed theology, went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, and came here straight after that. I'm from the Central Valley, but not from Ripon. I am now married to my beautiful wife, Bailey. We do not have kids. People always ask. We've been married since 2020. We were one of those COVID weddings that we had Mark did our wedding, and we had Bailey's two parents, and that was it. That was our wedding. And we got married on March 20th, 2020. So it was right in the middle of the mayhem.
Wow.
Yeah, our wedding was supposed to be in April the next month, but we just decided essentially to elope and just get married the next day. We realized we weren't going to be able to have any of our guests, and so we just got married.
All right. Were you raised in a
rare.
Christian? Were you raised in a Christian family, or did you come to Christ later in life?
I did. I was raised in a Christian family. Sorry. And so, yeah, I was born in my parents were both, they had left more liturgical traditions. My dad sort of in Methodist and Presbyterian churches as a kid. My mom was in the LCMS, the Lutheran Church. And they were not really fans of the liturgical thing. And so they, in their adulthood, began attending Bible churches or Baptist churches. And so I was raised in a Baptist church. And then in my high school years, I switched. My parents let me leave as soon as I could drive. And so I went to it was formerly United Methodist Church that had become non-denominational in the late 90s. By the time I started attending, it was about 2006 or so. And so they are still non-denominational. That is Kingsburg Community Church.
Did you grow up in Kingsburg?
I did grow up in Kingsburg. Kingsburg is home. Swedish Village.
My son's girlfriend, serious girlfriend, is from Kingsburg.
I would probably know her name. You don't have to mention it.
We're not going to mention it now, but I'm gonna send you an email. So
if she's anywhere close to my age, then I will probably know her.
How old are you?
Yeah, I'm 32.
She is very close to your age. Did you go to the public high school?
I did. Yeah.
Oh boy.
I was a public school kid all the way through.
We're having Central Valley bingo here.
Here we go. Yeah, this is something I don't get to do. I don't get to play the Dutch bingo in the CRC because I'm not Dutch. But hey, here we go.
Wow.
So that's my brief story. Yeah.
All right. And how about you, Mark? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Chicago area in the Christian Reformed Church. I was on a different podcast recently, and kind of mentioned that I'm as Christian Reformed as you could probably be, much like you kind of are, Paul, where all my grandparents went to Christian Reformed churches. All my great grandparents, some of whom lived in the Netherlands, were at the Christian Reformed equivalent there, and so my wife's family is all Christian Reformed as well. And some people would start to assume certain things about the church I grew up in, but I actually was raised in a church plant in the Christian Reformed Church. And so there were about 18 to 20 people in my church when we joined it. And by the time I left for college, there were about 250 people in that church. And so from being a child growing up in what was, we were in the shadow of Willow Creek. And so if people, not just in Chicago, but in evangelical churches during the 90s, really know, Willow Creek was the flag bearer for the new way of doing church in an outreach kind of way. Community church is probably a good term for it. And so although I was raised in the Christian Reformed Church, it was not first CRC of Dutchtown, USA, and so that definitely impacted my understanding of what church was like. I kind of expected that every church was growing, and doubling almost in size every 3 or 4 years, and really trying to reach out to the community and so forth. So that was my experience, and going to seminary at Calvin Theological Seminary helped me gain some of that regular institutional knowledge. And now I've served churches in Sumas, Washington, which is a farm town of about 900 people in Northwest Washington, near Linden, if there's people in the Christian Reformed Church who are watching or listening. And now I've been here at Almond Valley Christian Reformed Church for just over 7 years. So.
Okay. And tell me about this little podcast you guys got going. Why did you do this, and what's it about?
Yeah, it really started during COVID, during the pandemic, where we realized we need to do a midweek ministry to the church in a time where we can't be physically present together. And so it really started as a church local ministry idea. We started recording some vlog type things. Zach was preaching through Proverbs for the youth at the time, I think recording videos on that. So we would kind of just brainstorm on what that could be. And we just started recording our conversations, and that went to the youth, and then it eventually went to the whole congregation and turned into, hey, we should just talk about these things and record a podcast. And it's called Reformed Podmatics. And it's seen some modest success, I guess I would say. It's not a really big deal, but we have a really cool community of people who are listening from Ontario, quite a few people from Canada listening. We have some listeners from Saudi Arabia, from the Philippines, from Australia. Not all that many from each of those places, but it's kind of a neat thing where we thought this is making disciples of all nations. And so that was important for us to use technology to be able to do that a little bit. And the congregation's been really excited about it too, actually.
Do some of the people from Almond Valley actually listen regularly?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. That's probably
I would guess about
listenership.
maybe 15 or 20 of our weekly listeners are members of our church. Yeah.
Okay. Because nobody from my church listens to me. Except maybe Freddie and Nancy, if they want to see if I mention them. So here it is.
There you go, Freddie. I feel like Freddie's my friend, though he's never met me, because I will watch the Paul and Freddie show. But yeah,
no, it's the Freddie and Paul show. Freddie wanted
Freddie
to change the
Paul.
name at one point. I wouldn't let him, because you've got to give Freddie top billing. So
yeah, 2020 was an interesting year. Sorry, I was just adding to Mark's synopsis. It was just an interesting year, and it was a year where people really wanted to think through the issues that were taking over the media. Right? People were thinking about COVID. How should I think about it? What are my pastors thinking about it? So we did a few YouTube videos. Those got a few views, but we realized it'd be easier for people to listen to us on podcasts. Mark and I are both fans of podcasts. I listen to podcasts quite a bit. If I get home early and I have dishes to do before my wife gets home, I'm going to listen to a podcast. So there's different hours in the day that I'm filling in time. And so we figured that this medium would serve our people well. And it has been a blessing, of course, outside of Ripon a little bit. And that's cool to see as well. I think our name actually is part of our success. Probably people are probably looking up Reformed Podcasts, and then it may just pop up. That was incidental.
Well played, guys.
That wasn't planned.
That's Zach. It's all Zach. Yeah.
It was just a nod, obviously, to Herman Bavinck. That was the idea.
No, that's a great name.
Yeah, and one of the cool things, I mean, there was so much happening in 2020. You have Black Lives Matter, COVID. People were really asking a lot of questions, and much like your channel seeks to do, Paul, where pastors need to talk about these things and teach about these things. And we found there were so many things that don't really fit in a sermon.
Yep.
And would almost feel like you're reaching in a sermon outside of the text to talk about Black Lives Matter or any sort of political thing that was happening. It was a wild time. And so we thought it could be our responsibility as pastors to care for our people by hopefully quieting the voices that are getting a lot of attention at the time, which were quite extreme on one side or the other. We did an episode on vaccines, for example, and the Cliff's notes, I guess, of that episode was, we care less about the vaccine and more about what's happening in your heart, and whether or not you get the vaccine is between you and your doctor at a certain point and so forth. And so we wanted to say those things that we didn't really feel like were being said all that much in right-wing media or left-wing media.
Yep. Well, CRC is sort of a middle-of-the-road denomination in a lot of ways, and it's kind of our space. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, let's have at this thing. I don't know if you want to record an introduction or you've got some questions. Their idea was to interview me, so that's why this isn't really a full-blown randos conversation, but.
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation, just in the sense of, what are we even doing here on this podcast? It's cool that we're doing both ways. We're both going to be getting content out of it. And I hope that there is a sort of mutual benefit for both of our listenerships in sort of seeing something that maybe we don't normally see, or hearing from a perspective we don't normally see. I will say I'm a fan of your show, Paul. I watch... Yep. Not every episode, but I'm definitely following.
Why not every episode?
I don't have the time. I don't know how you have the time.
Aren't there 24 hours in a day?
I don't know. Maybe for you, but there's not for me. And so I definitely pick the ones that seem more of interest to me. But that is at least once a week I'm listening to an episode.
Oh wow! Thank you.
Good for bike rides. So I'm happy to be on your show. But yeah, my hope in having you was to be on our show. So it's just, I don't know. I guess we'll figure this out as we go. But we do have some questions for you, questions that have percolated for me over the last year or so of listening more and more to your show. So I don't know if you want me to start.
Go for it.
My question for you, Paul, is, anybody who listens to your show knows how long form it is. It's you may say nerdy. I think if I tried to listen to your show with my wife, she would be like, why are we listening to this? Not her cup of tea.
Yep.
Which is totally fine, obviously. Yep. It's not a show for everyone, and I'm sure you more than anyone know that that's the case. But what does the moderate success, 20-something thousand subscribers, what does that say about the spiritual state of our culture today? That there are people who are turning to avenues like your show or the other thinkers that you often will mention, like Tom Hollander or Vervaeke or others. Peterson, of course, would be a big one. Jonathan Peugeot. There's all sorts of others. Jordan Kuiper. The list goes on. What does the success of your show, in your mind, communicate about the state of things right now?
I don't know if it says, well, first of all, that the world is big and the internet has reach. I think it says a lot about the state of the church because, as you said, Mark, a few minutes ago, there's a lot to talk about, and our tradition, and one of the interesting things were when I first started doing it, people were like, gosh, I wonder what his sermons are like. And then they'd go and listen to my sermons and they'd be like, well, they're kind of regular. Mm-hmm. And yeah, if I suddenly started doing what I do on my channel over there in the church, that wouldn't fly, because then they would be like, what is he talking about? And so audience is very different. Mm-hmm. When Jordan Peterson, and actually Mark and I talked, you and I talked fairly early on after I found Jordan Peterson, Mark, and we were having a meeting together or traveling somewhere together, and we talked about this. I remember that conversation. And to me, it was like, that was a revelation, not just I had never heard anything quite like what Jordan was doing before, but that thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people were interested in it, and that YouTube could be used that way was like, oh. And I had always been interested. I mean, I had run my blog for years before this with all sorts of whatever I was interested in and writing things. It was just for me a part of sharing what was on my mind, and that other people would care and talk back. Just to be able to use the internet to find really interesting conversation partners was a revelation to me. And so I think it, so Estuary, that whole project grew out of this, partly because I realized that people want to talk, and the field is very broad. And so there's an appetite for it. And, I don't, there's always comparison. I mean, my channel in terms of compared to Vervaeke or Peugeot is by all means the smallest of the channels. That hasn't grown anywhere near as fast. That might grow faster than some channels. And so that's another strange thing about the internet, is that, when I got 2,000 subscribers, I was like, oh, I gotta really think if I want to do this anymore, because 2,000 to me, I was thinking of 2,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, but after
that's a
that,
mega church, Paul.
yeah, but after that, I began to figure out that no, those numbers don't quite mean what I think they mean. And over time, things sort of settled down. And so I don't know. I don't know. The whole thing is rather mysterious to me, but friends of mine who knew me before, when they'd hear that this was going on, and then they saw that it was doing, they were kind of like, oh yeah, well, this is just kind of the kind of stuff you've always done. These are the kind of conversations you would have with people in the Sacramento cluster or outside of a classis meeting or something. So it's just, we're doing it online and finding new friends.
Yeah. And isn't it kind of exciting too? I think of how I'm excited about your success, Paul, and I enjoy your channel a lot too. I know that I recall talking about Jordan Peterson with you when we were in a proverbial trench together.
Yeah.
Doing a lot of very serious church work, and which is an interesting context in which to discover those things, right? Because I think a lot of people are sort of in that trench in a lot of ways. And what we've been told is people just want happy, and they want uplifting, and they want short. And so I think what your channel has demonstrated is actually a lot of folks are looking for longer and in-depth and philosophically engaging content that, like Zach mentioned, isn't necessarily for every person. Some people need that wide open door, to go through, and it's just for everyone a little bit more catch-all in terms of church and how that's delivered. But I think that you, and I think particularly of Joe Rogan, the most popular podcaster in the world, with his 3-hour episodes, has shown that people are hungry for not just a conversation, because I think that could be a miscalculation of what Rogan offers. It is often an interesting conversation, but often it's like, let's just work this out and let's try to be thoughtful about it. Let's listen to an authority. I think that's actually a huge factor in his success, and also in your success as well. You are an authority on theological matters, and people are hungry for that, kind of as Peterson is an authority and has that presence that a lot of people are searching for.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you're exactly right about, a lot of my preconceptions about YouTube were sort of set aside. One of the things that I have realized, though, is that a lot of people are looking for someone who says what they sort of think, but says it better. And that can be a dangerous thing, because there are a lot of echo chambers. If you really want to grow a channel large, take a really hardline position on something, find that audience that shares that hardline position, and just keep hammering. Or you just hop from hardline position to hardline position. And even it doesn't even mean that they're conservatives. I mean, progressives do exactly the same thing. They just kind of do it in a different way. But there's a lot of you can get a big audience by being dogmatic about certain things. And what I've been surprised is that I'm quite open about my thoughts and my convictions, but also, my questions. And I think that's something that at least those who have gathered around this channel have appreciated, that what I really want, and I get this out of a pastoral context, what I'd really like is an honest conversation with someone. You're posturing, okay, we all have to posture in certain places. But and again, this really, to me, my channel comes out of experience as a pastor. What I'd really like is to hear what you really think. And even if you think I'm all wet, let me hear what you think.
Yeah, something I
absolutely.
often will...
Go ahead, Zach.
Sorry. I was just I relate that a lot to my own context of, so I'm an associate pastor, I guess, but one of the main things that I do is youth ministry. So I'm working with young people, and as we all know, young people have big questions that they suppose that me as their pastor will be able to answer in about 3 sentences or less. They just assume that I'm a machine. They can ask me a really profound question and just think that, oh, Zach's going to pop out. He's going to spit out the vending machine answer. You type in E6 and the E6, the Cheez-Its come out of the machine. And sometimes I can answer questions pretty quickly. I can just give them a sort of, quick response, but sometimes their questions are really profound. And that can be, as we all know, we've all been there, earth-shattering for us. And so I think, just thinking about my own experience in youth ministry growing up in my Baptist and then my sort of community church world, I didn't always have the sense that there were actually deep enough answers for me. And that I didn't have the sense that anybody could actually go deeply with me. And I think a lot of young people growing up in the broader evangelical world get that sense. They get the sense that I have all these deep questions and there's really no answers to these questions. And so whenever kids ask me these things, I hope to say, let's have a long, drawn out conversation. I would love to sit down with you to think about this with you. There's also some things that you could read, and I try to give them resources that they, at whatever stage of development they're at, could understand. Often, though, the struggle with kids is that they're asking bigger questions than their minds can find and handle answers for. But I encourage them, ask those big questions, but be ready for big answers that will require you to put in the work, to really think, because it's not just like everything has that short, quick answer that you can find. And that's one of the reasons I've come to then appreciate your channel and channels like it. It's because of the long form technique. I like that there's no real edits in your videos. There's not any production. I always jokingly tell people, I listen to this guy who has slides on his videos with black slides and yellow font. I'm sorry, Paul, it's maybe the ugliest thing that can possibly be, but
it's
that's
effective.
what makes it so great. It's effective, it gets the point across, and it works. And I think that there's a craving for not so much the quick answer. People are really wanting to get the deep answer. And that's what really is helpful for us. And as somebody who's now been through seminary, I've seen so many of my big questions answered that when I bump into another big question, I'm not so worried like I would have been in college when I hit those big questions. Those speed bumps, it's like, okay, there's a big question. I have big questions. I'm just not worried that there is a thoughtful way of thinking that through. And even if I don't arrive at something that's totally compelling, that's okay. I'm okay to live in that tension. I know that there will be an answer one day. I'm okay with not knowing everything now. And I think that that's sort of, faith-seeking understanding. That's what Anselm was kind of getting at. I believe that there will be understanding, but that comes on the other side of faith. And so I trust that that God has reasons. I trust that God is God. God knows what he's doing, and that there are compelling reasons for things that I may not currently in my present moment understand. And so that's something I appreciate your channel for. It allows sort of, I was telling Mark this, I think your channel, one of the reasons I think it's successful is because it's sort of therapy for the intellect, therapy for the curious intellect who finds religion in general interesting, but isn't quite sure what to do with it. Doesn't want to totally give it up, but also doesn't really want to put their whole life into it. And so they're stuck. And maybe, I don't know, if I don't want to be speaking ill of your audience, because I'm a part of your audience, but I think that that's what's helpful about your channel, is that it allows people to think, and it gives space to think. And I think that people appreciate the depth of the analysis that's happening along the way. And you're thinking through tensions in the church and outside of the church and the culture and whatever it may be. And so it's almost like, therapy for somebody who's feeling themselves in a state of what's come to be known as deconstruction. And for that reason, I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah, I think of that connection that you made, Paul, of people watch your channel, listen to your sermons, and they think, well, this isn't similar. But I would hope that one of the results of your channel, Paul, is that people could see that there's so much underneath what goes into a sermon. And so even if it sounds like a regular sermon, I believe that one of the positive impacts of your channel could be refining people's palate to listen to a good sermon that somebody could tell because they've been listening to thoughtful Christian teaching, and that versus kind of a shallow sermon. Because I think that's always something that I'm hoping is increasing in our own congregation, is that people would start to have a hunger for good food and to actually have a distaste for spiritual junk food. And that takes a little while to develop, probably, for people, especially if they've been raised on junk food, to use the food analogy again, to start to really desire vegetables and to even value that and enjoy that. I think that's hopefully effective of your channel as well, that even if the sermon and the channel sound different, I think at the core they are similar in engagement of ideas, a value for real truth, and a desire to do the work of getting to the truth and communicating it well. Because, I think of a situation where I think it was a tweet that was put out by one of the Hillsong United, that maybe for those who aren't really in church culture, that's a very popular worship band that sold a lot of albums, and they had some leaders who left the Christian faith. And one of those people who left the faith put out a tweet like, there's all this suffering in the world and Christians never talk about it, or there's all this stuff happening in the world, there's evil in the world, and there have to be answers to those questions, and the church isn't addressing that. And what he meant was, my mega church, which is very shallow and not thinking very hard about anything besides getting people in the seats, does not care about that, and doesn't really have an emphasis on answering really big questions when you come to church, like the problem of evil, or and it's not always just apologetics, but there's sort of an undercurrent of theological engagement that just wasn't happening in that church context. And so sadly, the result was a disillusionment about church in general. And so I think you're helping to address that hunger.
I hope so. Again, a lot of my channel is me thinking out loud. It's me thinking out loud. It's having conversations with people who have their own questions and their own stories. And then early on, I started a regular on my channel, which I called Rough Draft for Sunday, because I've always tried to, as much as possible, integrate both my church vocation and the channel. And so then I just thought, well, shoot, I got to prepare the sermon anyway. Why don't I just, by how it is Friday, let's give it a rip and see how it goes. And usually changes between Friday and Sunday, but good enough.
Yeah, it's an interesting window for people to see how a pastor does his work.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so for those maybe who aren't as connected to the Christian Reformed Church, it would be helpful for them to know Paul is in Sacramento. We are in a town called Ripon, which is a farm town that is between the large towns of Stockton and Modesto. And our town has a lot of Reformed influence, several Reformed churches. And I'm a little bit curious to hear if we might turn things in a Christian Reformed culture direction. Paul, how does Living Stones and how do other churches in the area perceive a town like Ripon, a church like the one we serve, like sort of the legacy kind of congregations that have just kind of been around for a long time? I'm a little bit curious to hear what, now that you've been serving in Sacramento, which is kind of more of an island, you might say, for so many years, even though we're quite close and see each other a few times a year. Ministry wise, it's removed. I'm curious to hear about your take on interaction there between, say, urban, suburban, and the more old fashioned, you could probably just say, congregations.
Well, a city like Sacramento is so diverse. You might look at, let's say, Modesto CRC would be in a situation in some ways similar to Sacramento. Sacramento CRC was founded as sort of a mission church. And very early on, it was a church that it was a racial reconciliation church in many ways similar to the church I grew up in Patterson. The churches in Ripon were much more a growth out of standard Christian Reformed church models of Dutch immigration, gathering together, building institutions like the Christian school. I think many people in Sacramento would see the Christian Reformed churches in Ripon just kind of like as, well, these are some churches and they have sermons and they sing songs. And, after the worship wars of sort of the 90s in the CRC, yourself and Emmanuel and First Ripon that just left the Christian Reformed Church. I mean, you'll sing some evangelical songs, you'll sing some hymns. I mean, it's sort of become kind of suburban Christian Reformed churches all over the place. And they would be understood as something similar to what someone might find in another evangelical church here. The difficulty that a lot of churches are facing, I think, in a place like California, especially in an urban place like Sacramento, is the culture war has sort of continued to sort of thin things out. And assumptions about what Christianity is have changed even in the 25 years I've been here. But that skews differently for all the different ethnic groups as well. So this church for a long time has served, has had a significant African-American presence, but also Asian, Pacific Island, non-CRC white folks. So it's tremendously diverse. A place like Ripon, although you guys have changed a lot. When I got here in 97, population of Ripon was like 4,000 or 5,000. You're probably over 20,000 now. And that's
17 or so.
That's bedroom community for the Bay Area continuing to expand out. So I don't know that the contexts are so different. I think part of what makes the churches different for you guys is you have, in a sense, a fully formed breeding stock of Christian reformity in terms of your institutions. and David Snapper, who's on CRC Voices, did a study a number of years ago, and in terms of Christian Reformed churches sort of handling change, critical mass is a big feature. And you guys certainly have much more of that than we have in Sacramento. We obviously did church planting, but even our church plants, hit certain segments. And so it's so broad and so complex.
Yeah, we just did a podcast episode on life in a rural church. And I mean, is Ripon still rural? I don't know. We have a freeway going right down the middle of the town. And so it definitely is agricultural. We mentioned in that podcast that half of the elders and deacons in our church are farmers.
Right.
And so definitely is going to have that influence. And I get the sense quite often that when people would hear about a church in Ripon, California, a small town, our church is 40 plus years old, so it's not a 100-year-old church, but has a lot of those same cultural elements to it. Connection to the Christian school being really towards the top of that list. That people will start to think certain things about what we do ministry-wise as a congregation, the kinds of people that would come in through our doors. And part of the purpose of that episode we just recorded was to say there's actually an increasing diversity in our own church. And of course, there is in Ripon too. And I would always hope that, even thinking of your listeners, that, okay, here are two guys from a church that's on their sixth pastor, and has been around for a long time, Christian Reformed church. They would have certain assumptions about things like individuality and how, it's probably just like a community that's in a suburban context and people just do their own thing and then they go their separate ways. But that's actually not the case at many rural churches where there is a hyper connectedness among the membership of our congregation. Again, especially through the Christian school, but even the families who are joining our church now are not sending their children to the Christian school predominantly. And there's a real desire to be close to one another, which kind of breaks the expectation that a church that looks like ours would just kind of be maybe a white, individualistic, consumeristic congregation. So that's one thing that we've kind of been working out lately and just seeing, wow, there's a lot of beautiful community here. That's probably not what always people would expect when walking through our doors.
No, and I've, in the years I've been here, I've had ample opportunity to work with my colleagues, and even in, I've visited your church and I've met with your council, and but in the Christian Reformed Church, I mean, my grandfather pastored churches that were predominantly made up of farmers. That was sort of the staple in the Christian Reformed Church. The areas of the Netherlands that people came over and then settled. North Jersey, some of the urban areas were different, but even in North Jersey, there were a lot of dairy farmers. And we just had our last farmer passed away a few years ago. He was a rice farmer. But, before I got here, there were dairymen, and that was the pattern.
So maybe you want to go with the next question, Zach? I feel like I've been talking a lot. So.
Oh, yeah, sure. Something that I don't know, there's a lot of things I've been thinking about in preparation for this, but I'm curious to hear more of your general thoughts. You've done whole long videos recently about the CRC, and I don't want this whole conversation to be just about the CRC, although I'm sure that there are lots of parallels with other denominations. I'm curious to hear what's going on in other denominations around the world. But what are your general thoughts on where the CRC is? If you want to sort of put your Nostradamus hat on a little bit and look forward, that's what Mark and I jokingly referred to it this last summer as we finished up Synod and we're thinking about the future. Where are your thoughts about where our denomination is heading? People who listen to your channel may know just from watching those videos, but I'm curious for our listenership to hear from you. I would say you're pretty much an authority on the CRC and the institutional history. And so it would be something I think beneficial for us to hear just from your perspective. And I will preface this one more time with one more qualification, saying I think you've done a really good job of giving an objective overview of the lay of the land, of the tensions in our denomination. And you have been maybe quiet on where you stand on this in some way. And that has helped all sides actually sort of say, yeah, I agree with Paul's lay of the land, his perspective on where we're heading. So I think that your perspective is valuable.
We try to gain low resolution pictures of the future by virtue of the signals that we're taking in. The big conflicts in American culture have in some ways been the tension between urban and rural. And of course, suburban is sort of halfway in between. The Christian Reformed Church had always had a mixture of urban and rural by virtue of the immigration patterns. But the aspiration of many, because of who and where they left from in the Netherlands, they tended to aspire to be dairymen. And I think a bunch went to Ripon and discovered, oh, we can do these funny things with almonds or almonds. And, we can make almond milk instead of cow's milk. Look at that. The Christian Reform, but at the same time, after the Second World War, so before the Second World War, there were lots of different immigrant churches around the US and Canada, and many of those immigrant churches followed the patterns of those immigrant communities. And these immigrant communities brought over often sort of separatist churches. The same with the Pilgrims. This pattern goes all the way back to the beginning of America. All of these sort of disenfranchised, dislocated people out of Europe came to the United States, started their own institutions, and the Dutchmen did that too in the Christian Reformed Church. And then, of course, the Second World War was this sort of vast mixing thing, and you had American urbanization really ramping up in the 20th century, and you had the baby boomers, and the Christian Reformed Church thrived during the baby boom, and for the Christian Reformed, like a place like Ripon, you guys have a thriving Christian school. That's really important for Christian Reformed churches. And so the Christian Reformed Church developed all of these institutions. They connected out in the world, but they also then got connected to the major divisions going on in the American church, which were sort of the modernist fundamentalist divisions that became the mainline, fundamentalist evangelical, all of this stuff. And I think a lot of people in Christian Reformed, so I grew up in North Jersey, which was one of those more urban Christian Reformed church centers. Mark, you were from Chicago, another one of those centers. In the last 50 years, most of those centers have been in serious decline. Partly because, of course, Dutch immigration stopped after the most recent episode after the Second World War. And the Netherlands was a different place from which people would emigrate from. Actually, my neighbor here in Sacramento was a Dutch immigrant for a number of years. He would have never gone to my church. I mean, he was much more New Age. Just going to a church like there were in the Netherlands, not going to do it.
Yeah, so, I tell people the boat has stopped.
Yes.
The boat ain't coming from the Netherlands.
But part of what the Christian Reformed Church had, when it still had sort of that thick Dutch cultural history, was it had a circulatory system in the US and Canada. And so people would leave from California, they would go to Calvin College, and then maybe after college, they would meet someone, they would find a wife and maybe move to New Jersey. And so you had this, through much of the second half of the 20th century, you had this very living circulatory system. And churches like Palo Alto CRC, San Jose CRC, Hayward, Walnut Creek, these churches in the San Francisco Bay Area were bringing in Calvin alumni. They were getting jobs in the city. They would plant a Christian school. This whole thing was happening really into the 80s. And after the 80s, that whole thing just started to break down. And I think Aaron Wren's neutral world framework, positive, neutral, negative world framework is helpful, because increasingly you sort of had part of the denomination increasingly sort of deconstructing with successive generations, especially in urban areas. And churches like in Sacramento, the Bay Area, New York, New Jersey, Chicago, these churches were declining. Whereas you had churches in rural areas that were in much more of a positive environment, just because of the culture war, they tended to do pretty well. I mean, churches, and if you would compare churches in Ripon versus churches in the Bay Area, probably in the 1970s, they were probably about the same size, had the same money, developing Christian schools. Since the 70s, the churches in Ripon in this area would continue to grow. You had some URC, some conservative split-offs, but in the CRC, those conservative areas are doing well. In the world-class cities, in rapid decline. Now, the one exception to this is Grand Rapids, where the circulatory system people would tend to retire in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids benefited from a fair amount of brain drain. A certain amount of people would leave the hinterlands and go and stay in Grand Rapids or retire in Grand Rapids. And so what you have in Grand Rapids is actually sort of another urban CRC center that hasn't experienced the decline of almost all the other centers. But that center also sort of had an establishment in the denomination. And so now with respect to the same-sex marriage issue, a lot of people in Grand Rapids just thought, well, the Christian Reformed Church is just going to sort of follow the cultural trends with respect to all of these things. And that's simply what we have to do. Whereas the churches in much of the rest of the country are following very different trends. And so you get this dislocation. And for that reason, I think in the next few years, we are going to see a split where usually churches split right and leak left. There's been a lot of leaking left, especially in CRCs in urban areas around the US. And I was just talking to a pastor in the Toronto region. He said, no, it's actually happening in Toronto as well. And so for that reason, there's going to be a separation in the CRC, and it's not going to be a conservative split off. It's basically going to be more progressive elements of the denomination, realizing that even though they have been the establishment for the last 70 years, they no longer have the hearts and minds or lead the hearts and minds of the rest of the denomination. And so, but this isn't necessarily easy for the other parts of the denomination that sort of win the fight, because all of those trends are still happening among us. And, you know, churches in Ripon still have to deal with the broader cultural issues that are going through the country. So
yeah, it's all in our front door now.
Yes.
Those urban issues are now everyone's issues.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. That's
so
social media.
It's a very complex thing going on right now. And a lot of people were wrong. A lot of people thought, well, the Christian Reformed Church is just going to continue to get, these terms are very inaccurate, more progressive on these issues. And it's about 10 years ago, I began looking at things. I thought, no, actually, there's a division, and the groups that are getting progressive are going to be in a pretty clear minority. And it was this last synod that Zach and I went to where that revelatory moment happened. And a lot of people who felt themselves in the establishment thought they knew exactly what the trends lines were, discovered this isn't the church they thought it was.
Yeah, it was a sort of shock.
Yeah, remember when they asked for, we had the vote, and then when someone asked for it, well, what was the count? And they said it, and there was just kind of this hush over the synod floor.
Yeah.
It's like, wow. I knew that the human sexuality report, a conservative report, was going to win. I didn't know by how much. If I had thought about it longer, I probably could have guessed, because in 2016, 15% of CRC clergy were sort of leaning affirming. That is not enough to win 15%.
Yeah.
I was just reading about perception, right? And there's that perception question of the institution and how it perceives of the broader denomination. And I forget what the article was about that I was reading, but it was a professor in the 70s talking about Nixon. And they said, the professor said, I think it's impossible that he won this election because I don't know a single person who voted for Richard Nixon. And so the purpose he's saying that is to sort of cast some doubt on the system or the process or something. But actually, in saying that, he's just revealing that he doesn't really know who's out there in America, so to speak. And maybe there could be a little bit of that in the Christian Reformed Church too.
Oh, there is a lot of that in the Christian Reformed Church. It has been for a while. And it's just that the establishment didn't know it, partly
Where
because...
does that come from? How does that start? Because like you mentioned, I thought you gave a great history of the CRC, and the CRC, maybe people don't realize, had almost a set liturgy until fairly recently. Probably into the 70s and early 80s, you could go to Shoreline CRC in Seattle and one in Western Montana and New Jersey and Toronto, and basically get the same liturgy. You're going to hear the 10 Commandments, you're going to hear the Apostles' Creed regularly and so forth. And do you see that And so from there, we have a lot of all kinds of diversity at this point. What changed along the way to create such a distinction, I guess, between the progressives and conservatives, like you said, for lack of a better term?
Well, I think, a lot happened. So the church I grew up in was very much a racial reconciliation church, as this one was too. The civil rights movement did a lot to transform America. And I think what it really instilled in both sides was a strong sense of the myth of progress, that now we all sort of know what's going to happen. And I hear this among conservatives often, now in a negative valence. Oh, the CRC is just going to keep getting more liberal. That's why we should leave the denomination. And it's like that's been the mantra that both sides have sort of assumed. And, the civil rights movement exposed a great deal of very non-Christian behavior with respect to racism that was in the North and the South. And so for a generation, the church struggled with racism. And then, of course, questions of sexism. Now, that's a much more, the genders and the sexes, that's a much more complex conversation in many ways. And the CRC, of course, fought over women in office for 20 years and couldn't really resolve it in the traditional means. And so at the end, sort of exhausted, embraced a political solution that would get it off the synodical agenda so that the CRC could do some other things. And that was the local option. And then, as everyone, conservatives and progressives, would imagine, well, slowly but surely, more and more classes seated women elders, and then eventually a majority of classes seated women elders. I was at the first synod where women were seated. Sue Kuiper, who both of you probably know from classes, she went with me to that synod. And of course, there was a lot of consternation about that. And so when this other issue of human sexuality issues came up, everyone, including the conservatives, said, well, this is just going to keep drifting left. But that assumes too many constants in the formula. And what was happening is that there's way more other things happening in the composition of the Christian Reformed Church, which meant that suddenly many young people, well, their voices aren't heard because they don't go to church and they're not becoming deacons and elders and going to synod to vote. And so, just with sort of the general deconstruction going on in churches, well, the church is going to get more conservative. And we watched this play out, and similar in terms of race. The Christian Reformed Church, partly because of the civil rights movement, said we need to focus on diversity and we're not going to so really identify as a Dutch church so more. Had to do it because, the boats were stopping. But what they didn't recognize is that Koreans, who make up 10% of the Christian Reformed Church, Latinos, African Americans, other immigrant groups, generally speaking, fairly conservative on many of these issues.
Yep.
And so suddenly, people who sort of got revved up to this myth of progress via the civil rights movement suddenly discover, wait a minute, I thought, and it's like, yeah, you did think, but it wasn't so simple.
Yeah, what I hear you, I think you just described it really well, is it's an identity question, right? And so after the identity of the Christian Reformed Church being the Dutch church crumbled, for better, I would say. It's good that we're no longer known as that. The question of now what are we going to be is probably what caused quite a bit of separation. Some say we're going to be the plugged in, intellectually relevant, quite honestly, leaning more progressive group. That's going to be our denominational identity. And we're going to, I think of the January series as kind of the ultimate example of that.
Yep.
That Calvin University puts on. And that will sort of be where the Christian Reformed Church is heading. Relevance, intellectual admiration of the world in a lot of ways for us. Whereas there would be a lot of churches just like our congregation that would say, let's move in a theological direction and let's really hunker down on the canons of Dort, the Catechism, the Belgic Confession, Reformed doctrines, and so that's going to lead in different directions, I guess you might say. Have a real appreciation and a practical appreciation for Reformed theology proper, more so than just a desire to be maybe moving in a different direction theologically and in sort of progressive ways. That's kind of how I've read it a little bit, but I could be off too.
It seems to me like the two different streams of Kuiperianism.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, if you're in the CRC long enough, you know that that's what's happening here. There's the two different intellectual streams, two different interpretations of Kuiper's legacy. That's a huge deal. At RTS, I remember hearing the name Kuiper fairly often from one professor, John Frame, who's fairly well known in the PCA, and he would talk about Kuiper, and the way my understanding of Kuiper through hearing from Kuiper or on hearing about Kuiper from him was that Kuiper was a very staunch, reformed, conservative theologian who had very strong opinions about the relationship of the church and the state. And if the world was more Kuiperian, the world would be more closely aligned with what general American conservative ideals look like. And that was sort of what I assumed was true about Kuiper. Then coming into the CRC and doing a deep dive on different Kuiperians, I've realized, oh man, there's like the whole like shadow Kuiper. There's the other way of understanding Kuiper's work and how it, like what Mark just said, seeking to applaud and appreciate the outside world, the non-Christian world. And I'm no Kuiper scholar. I'm sure that there are ways in which that's in some sense fair or genuinely Kuiperian, but I hesitate to think that Kuiper would just be applauding the world totally these days. And so that's just something I've noticed as somewhat of an outsider coming into the CRC. I don't know if that is correct.
It's true.
That's my analysis.
No, the Kuiper's the theologian of common grace also has a heavy emphasis on the antithesis.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
Yeah.
And you're right. And so the broad assimilation that's been happening in the CRC, certain churches have been sort of looking to the main line, you know, following the PCUSA, and, you know, they always sort of tracked with them. You've got other churches that, especially with the Young, Restless, and Reform movement, Tim Keller, John Piper. Oh, wow, look at what the Presbyterians are doing. And so it's a very big difference. And of course, in terms of churches as institutions, and Lyle Shaler long ago pointed out that countercultural churches grow better than churches with a lot of cultural alignment. Because why do you need the church out there talking about climate change and racism and gender equality and gay liberation and some of these things if the Democratic Party has real power and they're instantiating it into law? You know, you've had
they're
similar
saying
things.
it better.
Yeah, you've had similar things with, you know, Republicans and conservatives too. But if actually living in a negative context in Aaron Wren's formula isn't bad necessarily for churches' institutions, and we've watched mainline churches just an absolute free fall, while evangelical churches maybe not, you know, hockey sticking up, but at least doing far better than the mainline. And again, if you even just apply that to the Christian Reformed Church, the future looks conservative. It looks countercultural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You made an interesting point.
Yeah.
We keep cutting each other off.
Sorry, man. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to comment on Paul's point that one of the reasons, this is a new idea to me. I haven't heard you say that, Paul. I think it's fascinating that you mentioned that one of the reasons perhaps that churches are becoming, or our denomination is becoming more conservative, is precisely because a lot of the young people who would not be conservative are leaving the church. Right. Now, that's an interesting observation for at least the reason that because a lot of progressives, their pitch will be, look, young people are leaving the church because the church is too legalistic, pharisaical, conservative, you name it. And if only we could loosen up and become more mainline, they'd stick around. But it seems to me that they're sort of sawing off the branch that they're sitting on and saying that it's just an interesting, I think, observation. I had never heard that. And so I think that's another little quiver in a sense, or another arrow in the quiver, just of understanding this whole phenomenon. So thank you.
Yeah, well,
that helps me think it through.
I like Paul's point of the common grace and the antithesis, and I think if we're going to be fair, we would also probably need to. I was a little bit critical, I guess, in my description of the two different streams in the CRC, but I do maybe want to apply a little bit of criticism towards those of the more conservative type who would probably not really value common grace all that much. And so there's definitely a lot of that also in the Christian Reformed Church. If I have to check myself sometimes, it's to say the Lord is working in mysterious ways with drawing straight lines with crooked sticks constantly. And Calvin actually wrote quite a bit about how to value God's work in the world is to value the work that he's doing through unregenerate people who are not in church, who are not born again. And that doesn't mean, wow, that means they're actually good people and we should just sort of consider them a part of the church. He's saying that to say, and that's how amazing God is, that he could take somebody who is a sinner and would shine light on psychology or shine light on sociology or economics or politics in such an amazing way. I think Kuiper calls us to value that, as John Calvin does, but there's definitely that stream in the Christian Reformed Church that probably leans in a more Anabaptistic direction, that draws up a hard line, to use another term, a two-kingdom theology, where there's the kingdom of this world and it's going to hell. There's this kingdom of heaven that is pure and sacred and perfect almost. The church, it could be even conflated with at times. And I think the Reformed person is able to value what God is doing in both kingdoms, as the word describes what he's doing in both kingdoms as well. So I think that if we want to be fair, I guess I should be maybe a little bit critical of our camp, you might say. We are a theologically traditional congregation. Both Zach and I are complementarian in our persuasion from how we read the scriptures. This coming Sunday, I'm preaching on 1 Timothy 2, because I'm preaching through that book of the Bible. And, there's certain things that passage says that we believe, and God has communicated quite clearly there. But I think maybe it is good for us to at least look towards our side and say, we could be more reformed, probably in that sense of value and common grace.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main aims of our podcast. It's not to be self-serving in that we're trying to preach to the choir. We want to be really committed to principle and to making sure that when there's times to punch to the right, we should punch to the right. I think that's a feature of Mark and I's preaching in general, but it's also true of our podcast, I hope. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, and so I want to open another can of worms, if you guys don't mind. Kind of going back to our conversation from a little bit ago about long form formats of conversation and talking with people and helping to sort of do a spiritual triage of sorts for people who are hurting or who are wondering, who are seeking. I'm curious, Paul, to hear your thoughts about evangelism today. How should evangelism look in the 21st century? And how will that be different than what evangelism has looked like, in the late 20th century? I get the feeling we're more and more moving away from things like Romans roads, and that's the 4 or 5 spiritual laws or whatever it may be. And it seems to me that your channel is evangelistic in the sense that you are speaking to people who are all over the map in terms of their spiritual location and spectrum, their place on the spectrum. But it doesn't seem to me that your channel is bent on getting people to be members of churches And that could be in some sense seen as a criticism of your channel. It could also be seen as a strength of your channel. I'm sure you've thought about this. At what point in a long, maybe it's a months long conversation with someone who is struggling with their faith or with faith in general, how and when ought a Christian say, you need to repent and believe? Or should we even not? Maybe we shouldn't say that sort of thing. I would, of course, think, well, Jesus says it, so that gives me permission to say it. But how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's not clearly with an agenda? I mean, I guess it is an agenda.
Well, I don't have a problem with the agenda because,
right.
and I'm fairly open on, I'd say, I'm a Christian Reformed minister. Do I want
right.
you to, my definition of, the question of the definition of Christianity comes up often. And my shorthand definition that's as broad as possible is a Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. And now I don't think that what I do is in any way out of step pastorally, how I've seen my father, my colleagues, how they approach this. The Christian Reformed Church, I think by virtue of its Calvinist doctrine, is less rationalistic than many traditions, many Arminian traditions that assume that following Jesus is a choice that I have to generate out of my own something in order for Jesus to come near me. And I think God moves first. I think that's easy to see just in terms of chronology, because we're pretty short-lived creatures. God, I believe, was pursuing me before I was born, through my grandfather, through my father, through all sorts of things that made me me. All of that formation is part of God's work. Part of what a lot of mid to late 20th century evangelistic techniques tended to be fairly rationalistic. It was sort of part of modernity. Here's the scope, here are definitions, and now you're ready to go. Pastorally, what I have seen is more often people come to a place. It might be in a 12-step program. It might be in a prison. It might be in the ruins of a marriage. It might be having wrestled with things all their life, and they come to a dead end, and they realize that they are out of resources and they need someone to come and rescue them from themselves. And that doesn't often happen with the cameras rolling on YouTube. That much more often happens in the context of a local church or of some other gathering where trust has been developed, because so much of what people need to know in relationship, and this is what I try to model on my channel, is you may be a Christian, you may not be a Christian, you may identify that. That's, I think via Tom Holland's work on his book Dominion, that's a really complex question because there's so much Christianity built in to even our progressive atheistic moral systems at work in America. We would never have had sort of a gay liberation movement if it hadn't been for compassion for minority positions, which grows out of Christianity. But for people need to know that they are loved, and they are loved to a certain degree. It's really tricky to language because in some ways you love your children because they're your children, but it's not exactly right to say you love them just as they are, because actually you are loving them to becoming something more than what they are.
Yeah, there's a telos to love.
That's right. And you want the best for them. And it could very well be that the person you're talking to is not embracing the best, and you'd like something better for them. But especially when you're working with adults, they've got agency, they've got decisions to make. Yeah. And let's not be manipulative or coercive, because generally speaking, you're betraying the love that you profess for their well-being. So I think, generally speaking, as I have seen it practiced in churches and out of churches, you know, it's the old thing that pastors have said: people don't care what you think until they know how much you care. And so relationships come first. And so that's part of the reason why my estuary idea is not an evangelistic ministry. In many ways, it's much more of a pastoral care ministry. And when I see people come to Christ, it's usually because God has been working in ways that I never knew and I couldn't see. And sometimes they sort of pop up out of the ground, out of no place, and they're ready to go. Other times it's lots of walking with someone, being honest, sharing. And along the way, people begin to recognize, you know what? These Christians, they actually love people. And they love people because that's really what Christianity is about. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? All the way up to and including your enemy. And when Christians can live that out. Now, of course, the love thing, especially now in the whole same-sex marriage thing, are you loving the gay person by enabling this particular lifestyle? There's a big division in the Christian Reformed Church over that right now. And so I say, okay, fair enough. In enough time, we'll know a lot more. But, you know, I'm still going to continue to try to love it's always based on a perspective, based on what I think love looks like. And so that's what I want to forefront, and that's what I want Christians to be known for.
I wonder. I wonder if that your YouTube ministry, Paul, is kind of a harbinger of what is to come after in the negative world. You know, where what people are looking for, and I think they often find in your channel, is to be surprised that there are different kinds of Christians than the ones that we read about or that we see on The Office, or that we sort of build up in our mind. And you're the type of Christian who is intellectually robust and also cares about love, right? And so as we enter into a negative world where people assume certain things about Christianity, that it's almost like maybe some listeners wouldn't like this, but a darker world where a light shines brighter. As the Apostle Paul talked about Christians as shining like stars in the darkness. I think I see that as a huge factor in how evangelism will probably change. And so it becomes in the intellectual matters, but really people want to see that you actually love someone and will come alongside them. We heard a lot about that at Synod, of course, in the discussions on homosexuality and transgenderism and so forth. And you really had both sides saying we're about love, and probably meaning a little bit different things by what that would end up looking like. So I'm kind of excited in a way that as Christianity finds new challenges to evangelize in the negative world, that there are those opportunities for people to be surprised. And I think it's in that moment of surprise sometimes where the light bulb really does come on, like, oh, maybe what I had thought about the church or about Jesus or about the Bible, I have to rethink. Maybe that's part of what Jordan Peterson has accomplished too, is to surprise people with how cool the Bible is, how interesting it is, how powerful a story like Cain and Abel is. And maybe pastors could do a better job at that too, of surprising people instead of just sort of getting stuck in the ruts of yesteryear common evangelism techniques and so forth. People maybe are kind of done with that, but they're finding what they're looking for, hopefully, with your channel. So.
Well, I think there's going to be, I often talk about it sort of like gentle slope and steep slope. We're going to have forms of Christianity in churches that are deeply countercultural and deeply weird, because people see authenticity in that. They say, these people are going to do it. It doesn't matter how much you curse them. They're going to do it. Christianity needs that, but it also needs much more accessible communicators that can say, and Tom Holland's an interesting mix of both of those, because on one hand, if you listen to him when he was during COVID, he was talking about, he really respected churches that were sort of deeply countercultural and weird, because at least they believe what they say because they're putting their life on the line. But at the same time, churches are going to have to be able to explain, give an answer for the hope that lies within them in a way that people can hear and say, oh, yeah, that answers. So I don't think it's winsome or clear. I think you need both. And there's plenty of church to go around to afford both.
Yeah. Well, what I think of, so I like that idea of surprising people, and maybe I'll give a little snapshot, a preview of my sermon in this coming Sunday. Like I said, I'm preaching 1 Timothy 2, and that starts off with respect for governing authorities. And so in my sermon, I'm going to say, do you all love Joe Biden? Do you love him and Kamala Harris? And do your kids know that you love them? It's like, that's kind of the surprise that I'm looking for a little bit, and that's the call, right? That we're Christians, and we need to think about that based on what this passage says, and pray for them and lift them up before God, and love them in that way. And I think part of the reason I'm doing that is I think that I like the idea of surprising people and breaking those categories, right? Which is a lot of what you do on your channel, I think, too, Paul, where Christians don't have to just fit in this box or that box, and we don't have to talk like Fox News people or CNN. We can hopefully pull more from Scripture and from Reformed theology and the historic church, and that's surprising and refreshing to people. To 20,000 subscribers for you, it's awesome.
Probably not to all of them.
Hey, good though.
Yeah, I think I am, the Christian Reformed Church faces enormous challenges, but in terms of Christ's church overall, the Christianity has shown an enormous capacity to deal with waves of enormous challenge through the centuries. And I believe we will continue to deal with this one. It'll be messy. It'll be hard. There'll be a lot of heartbreak. There'll be a lot of loss. But I mean, look at the crucifixion. Messy, hard, heartbreak, loss. It's all got it.
Right. Amen. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Paul. Man, it's a privilege to
absolutely
make our friendship more public and official, in front of all of the YouTubers. We'll see you in a couple of weeks at Classis, right?
That's more than a couple of weeks, about 6 weeks, I guess.
Okay, yeah, true. About March. But anyway.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you guys for coming on my channel and at least giving a little window into, I know for a lot of people, what's the world beyond the camera? And these guys are a part of that.
Cool.
All right, I'll stop the recording.
All right.
All right.